deep in the frozen silence of the 1887 Montana high country, a Lakota warrior known to white men as Jonas Hale stepped into a smoke-choked saloon for the first time in years and walked out owning a trembling, bruised woman the entire town laughed at and called worthless. They said she was broken, mad, had forgotten even her own name. They were wrong. Beneath the dirt and terror, she carried the one secret that could make dead valleys run with water again. Ancient underground rivers only the old ones once knew, mapped in her dead father's hidden journal. What began as one reckless poker hand would soon flood a dying frontier with life, unite white settlers and native warriors against a corrupt lawman, and turn the worthless woman into the heartbeat of an entire territory. Stay until the end, because the final gunshot at Hawks Divide will leave you speechless. Drop a comment. Where are you listening from tonight? Hit subscribe so you never miss what happens when water returns to a land everyone thought was finished. The wind came down off the Absaroka like a blade in December of 1887, slicing through pine and cutting straight to bone. Snow still clung to the high meadows, thick and silent, the kind that swallowed sound and men alike. High above timberline, where the crazy mountains stood white and indifferent, a lone rider moved along a trail only elk, and Lakota knew. They called him Jonas Hale in the settlement below, but his true name was Tatsuka Witko, Crazy Horse, though he had left that war behind after the greasy grass. The soldiers never found the small band that slipped north into these mountains. Most were dead now anyway. Fever, or whiskey, or a hangman's rope. Jonas had buried the last of them himself, wrapped in buffalo robes that no longer existed. For 7 winters, he had lived alone in a log cabin notched into a shelf of granite, hunting meat, trading pelts once a year, speaking to no one. The town knew him only as the silent Indian, who sometimes appeared at the edge of lamplight and vanished again before questions could be asked. 7 years earlier, in the spring of '81, his younger brother, half-white government surveyor, full of foolish dreams about maps and treaties, had ridden down to mark watercourses for the railroad. A flash flood came out of a dry canyon, water thick with mine tailings and greed. They found the boy's body 3 miles downstream, tangled in cottonwood roots. Jonas knew the flood was no act of God. The New Silver Consortium had dammed and diverted an ancient underground stream to feed their stamp mills. The diversion killed his brother and began the slow death of the whole timberline basin. Jonas carried the body home on his saddle, dug the grave with a skinning knife, and never spoke the brother's white name again. So he stayed high, where the air tasted of ice and pine pitch, where the only law was weather, and the only company was ravens. But a man runs out of salt, and salt is life. One black night, the wind turned north, and the temperature dropped hard enough to split iron. Jonas wrapped himself in wolf hides, loaded his old Henry repeater, and rode down the switchback trail toward the yellow windows of Timberline. The town huddled in the valley like a sick animal. One muddy street, false front stores, the stink of coal oil and horse piss. The Silver Dollar Saloon spilled light and piano noise across the frozen rut. Jonas tied his pony at the rail, pushed through the batwing doors, and every conversation died for 3 heartbeats. Then the talk started again. Louder, because men always talk louder when they're afraid. He moved to the bar, laid down 3 prime beaver plews for a pound of salt and a box of .44 rimfire. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. At the big table in back, Marshal Virgil Kane held court. Kane wore a town suit and a silver star bought with blood money. He was laughing too loudly, slapping cards down like he owned the territory, which in most ways he did. Across from him sat a weasel-faced miner with a week's wages in front of him and panic in his eyes. The miner shoved forward a crumpled piece of paper, then jerked his head toward the corner shadows. Two of Kane's deputies dragged a woman into the lamplight. She was young, maybe 25, small enough that the rope around her wrists looked cruel. Her dress had once been blue. Now it was filthy and had dried blood. Hair the color of winter wheat hung across her face in tangled ropes. She kept her eyes on the floorboards, shoulders shaking, but she didn't make a sound. The miner's voice cracked. "She's quiet. Don't fight none. Worth the pot, Marshal." Cowan leaned back, thumbs in his vest, and looked her over, the way a man studies a lame horse. Hell, she looks half dead. What am I supposed to do with a crazy woman? Laughter rippled around the room. Someone yelled, "She doesn't even remember her own name." Jonas felt the salt sack heavy in his hand. He should leave. This was White Man's ugliness, same as always. He turned for the door. The woman lifted her head. For one heartbeat, her eyes, clear, storm green, unbroken, met his across the smoky room. Something older than words moved in Jonas's chest. He set the salt on the bar, walked straight to the table, and sat down opposite Kane. The room went dead quiet again. Kane's smile thinned. This game's full, breed. Jonas laid his skinning knife and tobacco pouch in the center, the pouch heavy with silver dollars earned from pelts. "Deal me in." Kane studied him the way a wolf studies fire. Then he shrugged and shuffled. 5 cards slid across scarred felt. Jonas didn't look at them yet. He was watching the woman. She had lowered her head again, but her trembling had stopped. The betting went fast and ugly. The miner folded. It came down to Jonas and Kane. Kane spread 4 queens with a grin that never reached his eyes. Read 'em and weep. Jonas turned his cards one by one. 3 black aces and a pair of 8s. Dead man's hand. The saloon exploded in shouts and curses. Kane's face turned the color of fresh liver. Jonas stood, scooped the pot into his pouch, and walked to the woman. He drew his knife. Men reached for irons, then froze when they saw his eyes. He cut the rope at her wrists, gentle as skinning a deer. She looked up once more. This time, there was no plea in her gaze, only recognition. Jonas took the wolf robe from his own shoulders and draped it around her. Then he led her out into the knife-cold night, past the stunned faces and the laughter that started too late. Behind them, Virgil Kane stared at the empty doorway and felt, for the first time in years, the cold bite of something he could not control. High above, the wind kept blowing, carrying the scent of snow and the faint, impossible smell of water waiting far underground. The trail climbed hard out of timberline, switchback after switchback, the pony's hooves ringing on frozen gravel. Jonas rode in front, the woman behind him on the same saddle, wrapped in his wolf robe. She weighed almost nothing, yet the horse felt the difference, as though the night itself had settled across its withers. Snow hissed against pine needles. Neither spoke. Once, when the wind dropped, he heard her teeth chattering. That was all. Near midnight, they reached the cabin, a low, dark shape against the cliff. Jonas swung down, lifted her off the horse like a child, and carried her inside. The fire had burned to coals. He kicked it alive, sparks shooting up the stone chimney. She stood just inside the door, dripping meltwater, eyes taking in the single room. Bunks, table, shelves of jerked meat and powder horns, one small window black with night. He pointed to the lower bunk. Sleep. She didn't move. "You're safe here," he said in English. Then, softer, in Lakota. "Hechel yeching kingyang." Something flickered across her bruised face. Recognition, maybe, or simple exhaustion winning. She sank onto the robes and was asleep before he pulled the door shut behind him to tend the horse. At first light, he stepped outside with coffee boiling in a blackened pot. The valley lay iron-hard under frost. He expected her still curled beneath the hides. She was on her knees 50 yards downslope, palms flat on the ground, as if feeling for a pulse. Jonas crossed the crunching snow. She didn't look up. Her fingers traced cracks in the frozen earth, brushed away hoarfrost, pressed again. When he was 10 feet away, she spoke, voice raw from disuse but steady. "Your spring went dry 3 summers ago." He stopped. "Someone dammed the feeder creek higher up," she continued. "But the real water never left. It's still here. 20, maybe 25 feet down. Old river, older than these mountains, was pushed up." She sat back on her heels, breath pluming. "My name is Ilara Hartwell. My father was Edmund Hartwell, territorial hydrologist. 6 months ago they hanged him from a cottonwood outside Billings for what he wrote in his journal." She reached inside the torn bodice of her dress and drew out a small, oilskin-wrapped book no bigger than a man's hand. "This is the only copy left. Kane's men burned the rest." Jonas crouched beside her. The journal was bound in scarred cowhide, edges blackened. She opened it carefully. Pages of neat ink, contour sketches, numbers, and symbols he didn't know. Beside them, rougher drawings in charcoal. A jackrabbit burrow, the slant of willow roots, the spiral of a hawk riding thermals. "My father learned from your people first," she said. "Then he measured what the grandmothers already knew. Every line in here is a vein of water the mining company wants erased. They killed him for it. They kept me alive only long enough to make me disappear." She looked straight at him then, green eyes cutting through the cold like creek ice breaking in spring. "I'm not crazy. I'm the last witness." A long silence. Somewhere below, a raven called once and was gone. Jonas took the journal, weighed it in his calloused palm and handed it back. "Then we keep you breathing." He rose and walked the slope with her, following her pointing finger. She showed him where jackrabbits had tunneled deep last fall, proof the frost line sat atop wet sand. She knelt again, scraped away snow, and lay her ear to the ground, like a tracker listening for hoofbeats. After a moment, she nodded. "Right here. Strong flow. Steady all year. Your brother's grave is less than a mile west of this spot. The same water that killed him runs under us now, waiting." Jonas felt the old rage stir, but colder, tempered. He looked at the woman kneeling in his dead valley and understood the hand he'd been dealt last night wasn't luck. It was reckoning. He drew his skinning knife, drove it into the frozen earth, and began to dig. The blade struck ice, rang like a bell, then bit dirt. By midday, the hole was chest deep, and the sun had climbed high enough to turn the frost to steam. Jonas levered out a shovelful of gravel and felt the ground change under his boots. Cold sand, damp, then wet. A dark stain spread at the bottom. Ilara dropped to her knees, cupped her hands, and lifted water that smelled of stone and deep thyme. First came a trickle, then a steady palm-wide stream that ran silver across the valley floor and soaked into cracks no one had seen open in 7 years. They worked without words for 3 weeks. She read the land the way a tracker reads sign, where sagebrush grew pale and stunted, too much alkali, where willows leaned one direction, follow the roots downstream, where jackrabbits had dug fresh burrows along a low ridge, soft earth, water close. Jonas followed, digging test holes, lining them with flat stones the Lakota way, building small check dams from pine logs and willow withes. Every evening they sat by the fire while she inked new lines into the journal, adding his observations to her father's maps. The valley began to breathe again. By May, the snow was gone from the south slopes, and the creek below the cabin ran bank full for the first time since '81. Grass shot green overnight. Elk appeared on the benches at dusk, noses testing the wind. Word traveled faster than any rider. They came singly at first, a dried-up farmer with cracked hands, a Métis woman leading 2 kids, and a milk cow on a rope, a pair of crow boys sent by their grandmother to see if the stories were true. Then, in bunches, wagons rattled up the switchback, raising dust that hadn't existed in years. People carried shovels, buckets, hope worn thin as boot leather. Ilara met them on the flats, where the new creek braided through fresh willow shoots. She never raised her voice. The wind did that for her. "Watch the jackrabbits," she said, pointing to a line of fresh diggings along the contour. "They won't waste energy tunneling through dry clay. Dig where they dig, no deeper than 8 feet, and you'll hit the same gravel lens that feeds this creek." She showed them how to read the land like scripture. House finches bathing in dust at dawn, water within a day's walk. Antelope lying down in the heat of the day, cool moisture rising from below. Cottonwoods with one side dead. The underground river had shifted. Dig on the live side. Jonas stood back, arms folded, Henry across his forearm, saying little. But when a man questioned whether an Indian and a white woman had any right to tell honest settlers where to sink wells, Jonas simply walked over, drove his shovel into the spot Ilara marked, and struck water on the 4th bite. The doubter shut up and started digging. By midsummer, the valley looked drunk on green. Gardens that had produced nothing but despair now carried beans heavy on poles, squash vines running wild, potatoes swelling under black soil. Children who had never tasted creek water straight from the mountains drank until their bellies hurt. Old men wept without shame. And every night, around campfires that now dotted the benches like stars brought to earth, someone would ask Ilara to tell it again, how the jackrabbits led them to life. She told it plain, the way her father had taught her, and folks leaned in the way men lean toward warmth in January. If you're riding with us this far, hit that subscribe bell right now, because what happens next, when Virgil Caine finds out the water he tried to kill is running stronger than ever, is the part that turns quiet valleys into battlegrounds, and one woman's voice into thunder. You'll want to be here when the storm breaks, because water, once it starts moving, doesn't ask permission. August came in hot and brittle, the kind of heat that makes men short-tempered and rifles sweat oil. Down in Timberline, the new wells ran sweet and steady, but the big mines up canyon still had their pumps screaming day and night, sucking the deep aquifers like a drunk on his last bottle. Virgil Caine watched his silver profits shrink as water that should have been his poured into settler ditches instead. He sat in the back room of the Silver Dollar, maps spread under a coal oil lamp, red circles around every new spring. One name kept appearing in his deputy's reports: the Indian's cabin high above the tree line, and the woman who could smell water through solid rock. He started quietly. A barn burned south of town, no witnesses. A well was poisoned with mine tailings. Then the widow Larson's 16-year-old boy vanished while riding the fence, a note pinned to her door with a skinning knife. "Send the Hartwell woman down, or we send the boy back in pieces." That night, the sky cracked open. Snow came sideways on a wind that could strip paint off wagon iron. The temperature fell 30 degrees in an hour. Timberline shuttered its doors and prayed. Up on the mountain, the storm hit harder. Jonas and Ilara had just bedded down when the first riders appeared out of the white dark. 3 men on foundered horses, frost rimming their beards. Then more. A Métis family with a wagon full of children. 2 Crow warriors leading pack mules loaded with rifles and pemmican. By midnight, 43 souls crowded the cabin and the lean-to, stamping snow off boots, breath hanging thick as smoke. The widow's brother, a raw-boned Swede named Gustafsson, pushed through the door last, face black with rage and cold. "They got my nephew chained in Kane's pump house at Hawks Divide. Said they'll cut the boy's throat if the woman ain't delivered by dawn." Silence fell, broken only by the stove's roar and the wind clawing at the logs. Ilara stood by the fire, journal clutched to her chest. Snow melted from her hair in steady drops. "They want the maps," she said, "and me dead after they have them." Jonas checked the loads in his Henry, then in the old Spencer carbine he kept for guests. He looked around the room. White men who once crossed the street to avoid him, Crow warriors who had every reason to hate every white face, women with babies tied to their backs and cradle boards and shawls. All of them were looking at him. He spoke once, low, in Lakota first, then English. "We ride at first light. Anyone who wants to turn back does it now. No shame." No one moved. They spent the night like soldiers before battle, blades sharpened on a whetstone until they sang. Cartridges counted and recounted. Coffee boiled black and strong enough to float a horseshoe. The crowmen sang a low-traveling song under their breath while they greased moccasins. Children fell asleep against their mothers' knees. Outside, the storm screamed itself hoarse. At 3 a.m, the door opened again. A lone rider staggered in, half frozen. Young Tommy Larson, wrists raw from manacles, eyes wild. He'd slipped his chains when the guards passed the bottle. "They're coming," he gasped. 20 men, maybe more. Kane's leading. Said they'll burn the mountain down to the rock if they have to. Jonas handed the boy a tin cup of coffee laced with whiskey. Tommy drank, coughed, then looked around at the packed cabin and the ring of grim faces. "Reckon they bit off more than they can chew," he said, voice cracking but steady. By the time the sky behind the peaks turned iron gray, the cabin yard looked like an old-time war camp. Horses snorted steam. Rifles glinted dully in the half-light. Fires burned in a wide circle, throwing sparks into the dying storm. Jonas stepped onto a stump so every eye could see him. Snow still fell in fat flakes that hissed when they hit the flames. "Kane thinks water is his to steal," he said. "Tonight we teach him differently." A low growl rolled through the crowd, part cheer, part snarl. They waited. They rode out at the tag end of the storm, 43 souls strung along the ridge, like a war party from another century. Snow had quit, but the wind still knifed down the canyons, and the sky hung low and iron. Hawks Divide lay 6 miles east, a narrow gut between 2 granite walls where the mining company had sunk its biggest pump, a squat iron monster that sucked the mountain's heart out day and night. The roar of it carried on the wind long before the riders saw the smoke. Kane had beaten them by an hour. 20 hard cases ringed the pump house, horses blowing steam, rifles across saddle bows, lanterns on poles through yellow circles on fresh snow. The marshal himself stood on the loading platform, greatcoat flapping, Remington revolver already in his fist. Jonas halted the column 200 yards out, just beyond Winchester range. The pump's iron throat throbbed like a dying buffalo. Virgil Kane's voice boomed across the snow. "Send the woman forward. Breed, or we start shooting hostages. Boy Larson's inside with a gun to his head." Tommy Larson was already among the riders, safe, but Kane didn't know that yet. Ilara nudged her horse forward until she rode level with Jonas. She carried no rifle, only the oilskin journal held high like a treaty flag. "Marshal Kane," her words cut clean through the pump's roar. "You want this?" She shook the book. "Then listen first." Silence dropped so completely that the only sound was the wind and the iron heartbeat below. She opened the journal and began reading, voice steady as a preacher over a grave. May 15th, 1881. A diversion dam was constructed without a permit on the Crow allotment, North Fork of Timberline Creek. The resulting flash flood killed surveyor Matthew Hale and 4 others. Signed, V. Kane, Territorial Marshal, for the Absaroka Silver Consortium. Payment received, $20,000, gold certificate. She turned pages. Dates, measurements, signatures, bribes. Each line is a nail. Kane's face went the color of tallow. "Shut her mouth!" One of his men levered around. The metallic snick carried clearly. Jonas never moved. He simply looked left and right along his own line. 43 rifles came up slowly and deliberately. Ilara kept reading. Kane screamed something lost in the wind and fired. The bullet took Jonas high in the left shoulder, spinning him half out of the saddle. Blood sprayed bright across the snow. He caught the horn with his right hand and stayed mounted, teeth bared in a snarl that had nothing human in it. That single shot was all it took. The mountain exploded. 43 rifles cracked as one, not at men, but at the ground in front of Kane's line. Snow and rock fragments fountained like geese flushing. Horses reared, men cursed. The front rank staggered back. Old Man Gustafson bellowed, "Next ones go through kneecaps!" A Crow warrior named Black Hawk rode forward 3 lengths, Winchester across his thigh. He spoke first in Lakota, then English, loud enough for every man to hear. "This water is the blood of our grandmothers. You have drunk enough." Kane tried to rally, waving his revolver, but his own men were looking at the wall of rifles facing them, at the settlers they had robbed and starved for years, at the Indians they had sworn were finished. Hands drifted away from the gun butts. Jonas straightened in the saddle, blood soaking his coat black. He walked his horse forward alone until he was 20 yards from the platform. Pain burned white-hot, but his voice carried colder. "Drop the iron, Kane. It's finished." The marshal's eyes darted. A cornered wolf, realizing the trap has teeth on both sides. He raised the Remington anyway. 3 rifles spoke at once. Kane's hat spun away. The revolver flew from his hand, shattered. He dropped to his knees, clutching a suddenly bloody sleeve. In the hush that followed, the only sound was the pump still hammering below, sucking the last life from the mountain. Ilara rode up beside Jonas, reached across, and took the reins from his blood-slick right hand. "Shut it down," she said quietly. Men moved forward. Settlers, Crow, Métis, rifles trained, ropes ready. The pump house door splintered under a boot. Valves screamed as they were wrenched closed. For the first time in years, the iron monster coughed, choked, and died. Far below, in the main valley, people would wake to the sound of water running free again. Federal marshals arrived 3 days later, badges glinting under the new sun, warrants crisp as frost. They took Kane in irons, and the consortium's ledgers besides. The pumps were dynamited by order of the court. Land deeds forged in smoke-filled rooms were burned in the street, while crowds watched in silence. Spring came early that year. Snow melted fast, and every dry gulch carried a new voice. On the ridge above the old cabin, Jonas sat with his shoulder bound in clean cloth, watching Ilara mark the next teaching circle for the water school that now bore both their names. Children, white, Métis, Crow, ran laughing through grass already knee-high. She walked over, belly just beginning to round with the child they had not planned, but would not trade for all the silver under the Absaroka. He looked up at her, then down at the jackrabbit tracks crossing fresh mud. "Still teaching them where to dig?" he asked. "Always," she said, and laid her hand on the scar the bullet had left. Because water, like truth, always finds the lowest place. And rises. The snow is gone now from the high valleys. But if you ride up past Timberline on a quiet evening, you can still hear water running where no water ran before, and see lamplight in a cabin that once knew only silence. That's the thing about hidden rivers. Once they break daylight, they never go back underground. So tell me in the comments, what hit you hardest? The moment a Lakota warrior sat down to a white man's poker game, or the second an entire mountain chose to fight for one woman nobody wanted? Drop your thoughts below. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that the things people call worthless are often carrying the only water left. We will ride again soon. Until then, keep your powder dry and your ears open for running water. See you on the trail.